We're going to talk about the Industrial Revolution. Coal, iron, railroads, and the growth of huge urban centers are the defining characteristics of the Industrial Revolution. Britain was blessed with large quantities of iron and coal. Britain also had water transportation networks for moving the iron, coal, and other products, as well as railroads and a good road system. The Industrial Revolution began in Great Britain, encouraging the growth of cities like London, Bristol, Liverpool, and so forth. Gradually, by 1850, the process spilled over to the continent. The Industrial Revolution is a contemporary of the French Revolution. They go hand in hand. So while they're fighting the revolution over in France, England is industrializing. It transformed the social and economic life of society. It was inspired by the scientific revolution and by the Enlightenment. It was an outgrowth of both. The Industrial Revolution helped shape the framework of our world today. So what was the Industrial Revolution? Well, a series of economic and technological changes began in Britain in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And these changes gradually spread to other lands in Europe, North America, and beyond. New technologies like the steam engine came to replace animal and steam power, and the factory, with labor, capital, and resources all concentrated in one place, came to replace the home as the center of production. And most of these changes occurred slowly over a period of time. So here's the terms. Be sure you get them all. So why does the Industrial Revolution begin in Great Britain? Well, Britain was a largely agricultural country before the Revolution. And so you have these large landowners who had their big estates, and many of them rented land to poor farmers. There was also common land that laid outside villages and towns that the poor were allowed to use. They were able to use little strips of the land for their own use. Well, starting in about 1750, there's a series of acts that are passed called the Enclosure Acts. And what these acts do is they take that common land away from the poor and they enclose it, they merge it all together into what will become large farms. And so what that means is you have all these people who up until now have had their livelihood depend on farming, but now they've lost the land. They can't afford to buy any for themselves, so they're out of a home, out of a job. This is good for industrialization because this means that there is a surplus labor force. At the same time, you have some of the aristocrats who rented land to the poor, and some of them are going to end up basically kicking the poor off their land, merging all their land together, and then mechanizing it with some of the new technology that emerges. So again, Britain has a surplus labor force, extra workers. Before the Industrial Revolution, most manufactured goods in Britain. So again, this is called the cottage industry, and it's mainly women doing the work, as you see here in this picture. And here, circled in red, if you press the down arrow, is Great Britain. Just so you have an idea of the geographic location that we're looking at. And as you can see, Britain is an island nation, and it's separated geographically from the rest of the continent. This will actually help them when the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars are ongoing. Yes, they become involved, but the people themselves are generally immune to what's going on. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, we have new technology that helps in. Another innovation was the spinning jenny. This was kind of like a big spinning wheel, and basically it allowed somebody to weave the wool or cotton or whatever into yarn or thread at a much faster pace, and also to be more productive because it could create at least 8 spools of yarn or thread at a time, and in some cases more. So again, this speeds up the process. James Watt, an Englishman, invented the first practical steam engine. Now, he didn't invent the steam engine itself. That idea, that technology, had actually been used going back to the ancient world and the ancient Greeks. But what James Watt did was he figured out a way to harness that steam power in a practical way, and he's really credited with beginning the birth of modern steam use. And his technology could be put to use in the factories. The power loom was an innovation of the Industrial Revolution. It was also a large loom that could produce wide bolts of material, and it operated on a line shaft where you had a source of power like, say, a water wheel, and then that source of power is connected to the power loom itself. Perfect for a factory. So again, we have to ask, why does all this start in Great Britain? Well, there's no one factor. Rather, there's a combination of circumstances that came together to create a favorable climate for growth. In the middle of the 1700s, the situation in Britain was just ripe for the development of industry. The country had a good food supply, a large workforce, and plenty of people with money to invest. And all the forces that had been slowly building suddenly came together in a giant burst of inventiveness. The changes appeared first in the textile industry. Now, for a long time, Britain had been one of the leading sheep-raising areas of the world, and raw wool and wool cloth had been one of Britain's major trade goods going back to the Middle Ages. All of it produced by hand. As I talked about, we have the cottage industries, women, spinners, weavers, working out of their homes. But, think about it. Would you like to wear woolen clothing all the time? It's hot. It doesn't launder well. It's itchy. And people began to realize as we move into the 18th century, the 1700s, that an alternative to wool was needed. So they hit on cotton, and they start making cotton cloth. It's hugely popular, and they realize they can't keep up with the demand for cloth, especially the cotton cloth. So they had to figure out a way to produce as much as they could. At first, because there's this huge demand, but they're not able to make it that fast, the cost remained relatively high. Cloth merchants saw that they could make greater profits if they could find a way to speed up the work of spinning and weaving. And so everything just came together. The result is going to be the factory. They brought the workers, the technology, the raw materials all together under one roof, and end result, the English textile factory. So again, let's review why it starts in Great Britain. Well, I already mentioned the enclosure acts. There's innovations in farming, in creating these large commercial farms. And so that means you have a lot of farmers out of work. You have a labor surplus, which could be absorbed elsewhere. So you have workers. Britain had excellent natural resources. For example, Britain had a lot of coal and iron, and these became readily available due to good transportation systems, things like railroads and waterways. Also, Britain had investment capital. By the late 18th century, merchants, shippers, and landowners had excess capital for investment in new economic ventures for profit. Charting unknown territories took risks, but many were willing to take them. Then there's empire. Britain had the world's largest overseas empire, And this provided markets for selling goods, provided raw materials, both of these things essential for industrial growth. Britain also had the world's most powerful navy and merchant fleet, so she had protection and a way to ship and transport the goods. Britain also had political stability at the time, for the most part. She did not have to worry about recovering from a revolution. There was one law system in Britain, and it was standardized. They were a constitutional monarchy. Britain had a parliament which promoted commercial interests. Britain had respect for scientists and the scientific method. In fact, Parliament even gave awards to great thinkers, and this in turn stimulated engineering and technical innovations. There was a spirit of intellectual inquiry and critical thinking. British inventors looked at new technologies like the steam engine and the spinning jenny, and they asked, can we use it, and how can we make it better? And then there's geography. This also gave Great Britain an advantage over other countries. It was an island nation with a lot of fine harbors. By 1850, Great Britain is the industrial workshop of the world. It's producing 2/3 of the world's coal by 1850 and a half of the world's iron and cotton cloth. So it's dominating. So Britain becomes the world leader in industry. They started the whole process, and they wanted to show off to the rest of the world what they'd accomplished. So, in 1851, London became home to the world's first industrial fair. And this was held in recognition of all the progress they'd made. The Queen at the time was Queen Victoria, and she was married to Prince Albert, who was just a huge fan of science and technology. And so this great exhibition, this industrial fair, was actually his brainchild. And he also helped to design the building that would house this great exhibition, and it was called the Crystal Palace. It was built in Hyde Park in London, and it was built as a special display and warehouse. It was more than that, though. It was a symbol for the Industrial Revolution, a showcase of iron and glass. It was built with products of the new industrial age. So here you see an old photograph of the Crystal Palace, and the length of the main body of the building was 1,848 feet long. So that is big. And it was much more than just a building to the British people. It was a symbol, like I said, of the Industrial Revolution, and it symbolized Britain's leadership in industry. It was a statement to the rest of the world, basically saying, look at everything we've accomplished. It was a metaphor for the hope and optimism and pride associated with British triumph of industry. Reason, science, and technology at work. That's what the Crystal Palace was. And what's really interesting is they held the great exhibition, and there were more than 14,000 people coming, scientists, inventors, coming to show their goods, their inventions. Here you see what the interior would have looked like. So imagine 14,000 little booths set up, showing goods. 7,000 of them were British. The other 7,000 came from other countries. France, other countries in Europe. The United States had 500 plus exhibitors. Some of the things Americans exhibited: false legs or artificial legs, false teeth, chewing tobacco, various types of firearms. And people came from all over the world to visit this. An interesting fact is that after the Great Exhibition was over, the following year, in 1852, the Crystal Palace was dismantled, moved to another location, and then completely rebuilt. and it will remain there, or it would remain there, from 1852 until 1936, when unfortunately it was destroyed by fire. So what are some of the consequences of the Industrial Revolution? Well, it brought radical changes in transportation and communication. For example, the railroad. It connected the countryside and urban areas faster than ever before. It facilitated movement of people, ideas, and goods. It fueled industrial growth. That labor surplus, all those out-of-work farmers, a lot of them were used to build the railroads. And it revolutionized human perceptions. It could travel up to 50 miles per hour, which today to us isn't that fast, but 200 years ago it was like lightning. To many people, the railroad represented the awesome speed, power, and excitement of the revolution. Railroad tunnels and bridges now spanned the landscape. Bridges were built over rock and water. Train stations became industrial age cathedrals. And what I mean by that is that if you look back at the Middle Ages, you see that cities and towns would compete with one another to see which could build the greatest, most beautiful, grandest cathedral. Well, now, in the 1800s, cities and towns are competing with one another to build the greatest, grandest, most beautiful train stations. There were critics, though, of the railroad. Some people argued that they were a disruptive force. They eroded the traditional values of country life. They scarred the landscape. And that was true. But they also revolutionized society. Another consequence was the growth of the middle class. You see, the bourgeoisie, this group I've mentioned, these people profiting off the Industrial Revolution. They're becoming very wealthy. And they even have something that a lot of people didn't have, leisure time. And because there's new technology that makes their lives easier, on the one hand, because they have money. And so, along with the growth of this middle class, we also see the growth of new activities designed for this leisure time. Things like sports, department stores, people would go to the theater, restaurants, and so forth. And then another consequence was the factory itself. It revolutionized production. Everything was housed under one roof: the machines, the labor, the raw materials. It was more efficient, more productive, and more rational. But people began to ask, was it more humane? Now, we see women entering the workforce in very large numbers. So they're no longer in the home. And these are the lower class working women. We see child labor. Many families couldn't afford to survive unless every member of the family was working. And so mothers, fathers, and children would work. Quite often the children were even put to work in very dangerous areas. Sometimes there would be a machine, for example, with a little opening that only a small hand could reach. Sometimes in the coal mines, children would be used as well. Sometimes in the coal mines, the children would be used to go into small tunnels that in which larger adults couldn't fit. Sometimes this was very dangerous. So imagine you're a child, and your day consists of getting up much before dawn, long before dawn. You get up like 4:30, eat a very quick bowl of porridge or something if you're lucky, get to work, and you might work anywhere from 8, 10, 12 hours because there were no regulations. There's no working day. It all depends on what the factory owner decrees. And so you might be, say, a runner. You might be a child who is responsible for running materials from from location to location to location. And so you might spend your entire day on your feet moving back and forth, with only a very short lunch break. It would be exhausting. And at the same time, because these children are working all day, they're not getting an education. So they're not going to school. In addition to this, we see workers being exploited. We see families being fragmented. You might have a father and a son going to work on the first morning shift, and then a mother and the other children going to work later in the afternoon. So they're not really having that quality family time. There's drudgery. You're doing the same thing over and over and over. Monotony. There's health and safety hazards. Many factories were very dangerous, and there were no regulations, as I said, to regulate what's going on. You know, what would happen today if you are working in a factory and you're injured? Say you work on a machine and your hand is cut off. Well, you're protected. Workers' compensation steps in. Businesses are required to have this. Your medical is paid. Your salary is paid. If you cannot go back to work, you become a permanent total and you receive your salary for life. They also will try to retrain you and find another job for you. But if you can't, you will still receive your salary. So my point is, in today's world, things like workers' compensation, health insurance, all those things, commonplace. 200 years ago, not required. So if you are injured on the job 200 years ago, well, there's a guy waiting to take your job. And the company is most likely not going to do anything to help you. Your day becomes organized around the clock and the whistle. Another consequence was the effect on cities as they paved the way towards modern urban civilization. Industrialization affects the size and economic importance of cities, because if you have a factory, that makes your town more important economically. And in many parts of Great Britain, industrial towns sprang up almost overnight, beginning around 1800. Smoke rising from the factories came to symbolize both plentiful jobs and unhealthy working conditions. They became magnets for surplus labor from the country and investment capital. They were a symbol of industrialization. The modern city had variety and diversity. It was a marketplace of ideas, styles, people, and goods. They contained learning opportunities and scientific institutes. In the cities, the sexual attitudes were much looser. A lot of writers had problems with this. For example, Charles Dickens. A lot of their writings sharply criticized the social problems of the city. Problems such as crime, congestion, noise, and hypocrisy. And in the early phase of industrialization, cities faced some huge problems. You know, you've got to think, what goes into making a city? What do you have to take into account? Well, housing, sanitation, transportation, how to provide for a massive influx of people. There was a painful transition from the relative simplicity of the country, the security that you had, to urban insecurity and complexity. Most people didn't come to work in factories because they wanted to. Rather, they were forced to because their way of life changed. And many of these cities were thrown up so quickly that no thought was really given to any of those things I just mentioned. The result is going to be cities with very poor quality of housing, what we would call, what becomes tenements, buildings that are falling apart, no sanitation, and so forth. London was also one of these industrial cities, and here you see a scene of the smoke from the smokestacks of the factories. It doesn't look very appealing, does it? The river also, the Thames River, which had been polluted for centuries, became even more polluted, almost black with the refuse of the factories. And here you see just a street scene. If you worked in one of these factories, lived in one of these cities, you would not have running water in your home. There would be a pump, usually like one for a block, sometimes one for several blocks, and you'd have to go and get your water. Now, another thing that was affected by the Industrial Revolution was the class structure. Industrialization made the social class structure much more diversified and complex. Karl Marx says, "Rich or poor, not much in between." Each social class now has more variety, more gradations of money, status, and so forth within each group. Take, for example, the middle class, the city dwellers who are making money off the revolution, the bourgeoisie. Now, you have the bourgeoisie, but within the bourgeoisie there are different levels. There's an upper crust of men with capital, for example, and capital is referring to money, property. For example, bankers, factory owners, and so forth. They all have investment capital, money to invest. In between, there's a group of professionals, such as doctors, factory foremen, and so on. The bottom tier consists of shopkeepers, salespeople, accountants, and so forth. So they're all considered to be the middle class, the bourgeoisie. The only unifying factor is that their careers are made by talent and hard work. Well, then another class is the urban working class. These are the artisans and the craftsmen who are gradually displaced by factories and machines. And as a result of that, we're going to see radical protest movements begin, and they're going to end in just exploding in rebellion and machine breaking. There was a group called the Luddites who would actually break into factories at night and throw their shoes into the machines to try to break them. Well, at the bottom, we have the proletariat. They are the factory workers, and many of them are unemployed artisans and craftsmen. Many of them are the farmers who lost their land and are forced to come into these new cities. Frederick Engels was the rare case of a rich guy who became a radical. He was German, and he was living in England. And in 1844, he wrote Conditions of the Working Class in England. And in it, he described the misery and hardship of the proletariat. He spoke of their low pay, long hours, lack of benefits. He spoke of up and down business cycles, unemployment, boredom, drudgery, and the alienation of the factory worker. Well, another huge consequence of the Industrial Revolution was the issue of reform. And Britain is going to end up becoming a pioneer for reform, gradually enacting a series of reforms that will tame the rest of the abuses. So this whole process starts in Great Britain, and for many years the Industrial Revolution was limited mostly to the country of its birth, Britain. The reason was simple. Britain wanted to keep the secrets of industrialization to itself. So, up until 1825, it was actually against the law for engineers, mechanics, and tool makers to leave the country, because they might take the secret with them. Eventually, though, it did spread to the United States and continental Europe. Now, industry made very little headway on the European continent before 1815. The French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars totally disrupted business all over Europe, and by the time peace returned, Britain had a huge lead. But even though industrialization did spread throughout parts of Europe, No other European country came close to rivaling Britain as an industrial power before 1850. In 1850, Britain still produced most of the world's iron and coal. British factories and mills accounted for 70% of Europe's cotton cloth production. And here you see on this map industrialization by 1850, and you can see the various places on the continent that are becoming industrialized. Because England was the first country to industrialize, social problems were the worst there. Most people made the transition from country to city by necessity rather than choice. When the Industrial Revolution reached Belgium, Germany, and other parts of Europe, these countries learned from Britain's mistakes, and so the problems won't be quite so bad there. And what we see happening is that by 1850, conditions for workers all over Europe were improving gradually. But class tensions and factory abuses remained a major problem for every country that experienced the Industrial Revolution. In 1848, the French reformer and writer Alexis de Tocqueville gave a warning. He wrote, "Consider what is happening among the working classes. Do you not see spreading among them, little by little, opinions and ideas that aim not to overturn such a government, but society itself, to shake it to the foundations upon which it now rests? Do you not see how little by little it comes to be said among them that all those placed above them are incapable and unworthy of governing them? That the division of wealth as it has now happened, or as it has happened in the world up to now, is unjust." And then de Tocqueville paused because he was giving a speech. He had written this, but he's giving a speech. And then he continued and said, "Gentlemen, I believe that at this very hour we are sleeping on a volcano." And what he's talking about is all these workers who have access to new ideas that we've been talking about, ideas like liberty, freedom, equality, progress. So they have access to these ideas, yet they're being oppressed in the factory and by the factory system. And it's going to culminate in an explosion. The years to come will prove how right de Tocqueville was. And here are just some of the big changes that came as a result of the Industrial Revolution. Huge changes in the pattern of everyday life. I talked about shift work, the work week. Manufacturing comes to dominate the economy. People leave the country and move to cities, so cities grow, and we see the origins of the working class and the middle class.